Hey, this can be called part two essentially to the last video I made on the Chinese state visit. Firstly, a quick update about that. There has been a joint signing of a nuclear power deal today, with plans to operate new nuclear power facilities, I believe, in Somerset and elsewhere. It's said that will create 25,000 jobs. Of course, this is coming in the backdrop of 15,000 jobs being lost from steelworks. Like I said in the last video, I don't really know all the ins and outs of that, so I'm not going to get myself into the deep end by trying to comment on things that I really don't know that much about. Um, so I'm not going to comment in detail about that. But I do want to comment about some of the things around this visit, notably the demonstrations. Um, what I've just seen was inevitable, really. I'm not surprised at all by this. There were counter demonstrations, there were people representing human rights groups, there were dissidents, people like Chen Guangchen, Joshua Wong from the Hong Kong movement, of course, Amnesty International representatives, and Tibet people, so people who are very, very critical of the Communist Party. I don't know about the numbers because I haven't seen any reports quoting numbers, but I would guess somewhere around 50 people. They were outnumbered, vastly outnumbered, according to Channel 4, by pro-China demonstrators. Um, one group of people said they come from Birmingham. There was other groups. Whether these are Chinese nationalists, Chinese nationals who are in the UK. Well, they are Chinese nationalists, but Chinese citizens in the UK, um, or whether they visit like they're tourists. I'm not really sure. Some of them seem to be older people. Some of them are younger people. I'd imagine overseas students. But one thing is clear: the Chinese embassy has definitely encouraged this. How do I know that? Because Amnesty International, their people, discovered boxes full of Chinese flags outside the embassy. So this was an orchestrated event. This wasn't sort of a spontaneous thing with Chinese people thinking, "Oh, let's welcome our president." It was orchestrated and organized by the Chinese side as a publicity stunt, basically, to ostensibly show how popular she is. Um, Now, I raised this point earlier in one of the videos about this, and a guy countered that when David Cameron visited China, the British embassy was allowed to encourage British people to welcome him. I don't know if that's true or not. One thing I will say though is that if there was a situation where, say, a group of British teachers in Beijing were to wave British flags welcoming Cameron, they'd probably be ridiculed back home, um, and they'd be called Tory party insiders or something like that. It simply doesn't happen. It's not that David Cameron is hated. There are people in Britain who support David Cameron, but it's just that we don't have that sort of nationalism in the same way. Today, I'm talking about. Certainly, you could say that was very obvious at the height of the British Empire, but today it just doesn't happen. Possibly in sporting events, but I do think it's fair to say that if you have a group of British people waving the British flag around Beijing, um, definitely people would be wary of that. China is still, I want to be careful about the terminology I use here. Um, it's still quite a conservative society, so I think Chinese people who saw a group of Britons waving the British flag would maybe be wary, because there's a lot of people who have a very long memory. They still bring up the Opium Wars every time these issues are discussed, even though the Opium Wars was 170 years ago and far worse things have happened in China in that time at the hands of the Communist Party. Um, so I do think that there's a very cynical ploy by Beijing to export overseas nationalism. This is just a small sampling. I don't want to exaggerate the situation. There wasn't serious violence. There was some anger on both sides, but more of it was, from the pro-China side, it was more jubilant. It's kind of like excitement to see the president. I know a few years ago when Hu Jintao visited Britain, he visited Chinatown, and there were very big crowds to welcome him there. Um, I do think that it is noticeable that there's a sort of, China, for a country that loves to talk about um, internal affairs, actually exports its culture in a very big way. Now, on the surface, I have no problem with that. I like Chinese culture, I like Chinese food. I'd be a hypocrite if I was to attack that. I use products made in China. I buy Chinese noodles for lunch, So definitely there's a positive aspect to this. However, I do think a lot of people are going to be very wary of this situation because they're going to think, well, wait a second, Chinese nationals come to other countries and they export their culture, but to what extent do they actually integrate into the host nation? I want to touch a little bit on this because I've had experience of it, and also the other issues that I mentioned. Firstly, it wouldn't be fair to say that there's no integration. That's not quite true. I've known a lot of, for example, overseas students, partly because of my line of work. I'm not in the job right now, but because of my line of work, I've had a lot of experience with Chinese students. Um, they tend to come from richer families. Um, Sometimes they're not particularly open-minded. They just want to stay in their apartment all day and play computer games. But to be fair, um, I've had experience of overseas Chinese who are open-minded, who want to learn about Western culture. Certainly, a lot of my friends are open-minded. I probably wouldn't be friends with them if they weren't. I very much believe in the principle of when in Rome, do as the Romans do. I mean, when I went to China, I should say, I deliberately didn't hang around with other Westerners. I tried to speak the language, I tried to abide by local customs and so on. And I think that's right. I think it's the way it should be. What overseas Chinese need to understand is that if you're waving the Chinese flag around, um, you need to be aware of how that comes across. Now, to be fair, they wave the British flag as well, so that's a gesture of, oh, well, we're patriotic Chinese, but we're not anti-British. Um, so they're kind of trying to show that it's a mutual situation. But the truth is, for right or wrong, there is a lot of wariness in the UK about this state visit in a way that you would not get with France or the United States or Western countries. The reason being, well, a whole range of reasons. There is a human rights issue. There is issues to do with cyber espionage. There's a lot of things. Now, for me, I feel very uncomfortable um, because I feel like it's a love-hate relationship. Like I said in the last video, I love China, and part of me thinks, well, it's good. This is a country that I have a lot of fondness for, and it's better for countries to work together than against each other. Of course, it is. So, from a diplomatic perspective, arguably, it's a good thing. However, the the moral side of me does question it. Now, Xi Jinping, to be fair, Laura Kuenssberg, the Believe channel, no, she's BBC correspondent, did ask tough questions. She gave quite a diplomatic answer. He gave an unusual answer. Usually, when Chinese presidents are asked about human rights, they either try to change the subject or say it's about internal affairs. She gave an unusual answer. He said that around the world we see there's areas that need to be improved, and he kind of yeah, it was quite a diplomatic answer. It wasn't, I believe, an entirely truthful answer, but nevertheless diplomatic. I will say one thing. China definitely has an appalling human rights record. There's no question about that. However, compared to Saudi Arabia, China is like Norway. Saudi Arabia is abysmal, and we are still very, very cozy with Saudi Arabia, much cozier probably than we are to China. Now, if it's a case of dealing with Saudi Arabia or dealing with China, I choose China, because at least China has a far better record on women's rights, at least today, than Saudi Arabia does. China's a secular society. I believe that's something that's positive. There's a lot of things about China I would commend, actually. So I am open-minded on this, but the issue about nationalism, it's something that has been apparent for quite a while now. The Xi administration has definitely used it. The Hu administration done it to some extent, but the Xi administration is really doing it. It was very, very obvious during the Beijing Olympics. That was when Hu was in power. Um, some very ugly scenes when the torch relay was going through London, and those guys in blue were kind of got into clashes with the Tibet protesters. Chinese nationals got involved. Now, to be fair, the Tibet protesters, in my opinion, didn't exactly help matters by attacking someone in a wheelchair holding the torch. That was just stupid. But the truth is, there was bad behavior from both sides. I do think what Chinese nationals need to understand is in Western countries, we have freedom of expression. So whether you like it or not, those people protesting against Mr. Xi's visit have every right to. That is free expression. Um, you can't silence them. You can't just try to harass them and bully and intimidate them into silence. And I am saying that you are the side that is doing that. You know, if I saw a case of a group of Tibet protesters surrounding a single Chinese person, I would condemn them and say, no, that's not the right way to go about it. But more often than not, it is the Chinese who work in big numbers. And that's something I don't have a great deal of time for. Um, I mean, that's all I'm saying. You have a right to demonstrate. You have a right to express your views. But just remember, you're not in China. You're in the United Kingdom. You have to respect this country. And you have to respect the fact that part of respecting this country includes the fact that we have free expression. So when Western journalists ask Mr. Xi tough questions, that's their right. In fact, we expect it. As for the business deals, well, I've made the point if you're getting into an agreement with someone, you have a right to know a bit about the background. I think that's a completely normal, fair principle. Just like if we had, for example, urban unrest going on, let's say this was 2011 and the England riots were going on when there was a lot of riots over the austerity cuts. The Chinese side, no doubt, would have questions. Is Britain stable? Can we invest in Britain? And that would be fair. I wouldn't have a problem with that. So my point is saying that questions about human rights are illegitimate. I don't agree with that. I'm sorry, but I just don't agree with that. I think if you are doing trade with someone, you have a right to know the character of the person that you're doing trade with. And I'm personifying countries here. Um, so to Chinese people living in the UK, I hope you have a good experience here. I hope you make the most of your studies or your business or whatever it is. I'm not hostile to you at all. Like I say, I want you to have a good experience here. But just remember, you're in the UK, and if you are overtly nationalistic, that's not going to go down too well in this country. It's disrespectful, in my opinion. The Opium War not relevant today. It was a very long time ago. That is just not relevant today. So stop bringing it up. Um, and that's all I have to say, really. I'm not saying those Chinese people don't have a right to wave their flag and so on. I mean, like I say, they are waving the British flag as well, so they're being careful about how they're doing it. But they certainly have no right to harass those who disagree with them. And I'm also cynical about it because I think it was set up. I don't know if that's a spontaneous gathering. Um, you know, if it was genuine admiration for Xi, if it's a genuine thing, okay. But I think it's a little bit pathetic that the Chinese embassy has to encourage people to do that. As for what that guy said about the British embassy being allowed to do that, well, I don't know. If that's true, then okay, it's a balanced situation. But I'm certainly wary. I mean, there are Chinese newspapers in the UK published in Chinese that will basically toll communist propaganda. And I think we have to be very, very wary of the influence of state-run media in this country. For example, Confucius Institutes, which are being partnered with British universities. I have no problem with partnerships. I think that could be a good thing. But if it's a case of those institutes are just promoting CCP propaganda to their classes and not allowing any different opinions, that's something that we should not tolerate. By all means, let them have their perspective, but as long as they're allowing another point of view. This is not China, and I mean this can be seen in other Western countries because there was that billionaire, forget the guy's name, but he wanted to buy the New York Times. Well, he's well known as a stooge of the Communist Party. If he bought the New York Times, all you would ever hear from the New York Times is pro CCP pieces. Now, I'm not saying that Western media should be overtly critical of China, but I am saying that you need to understand media in the West is not the same as China. It's it's far from perfect. I mean, I've no intention of defending the likes of Fox News. Believe me, Fox News is subservient to the Republican Party. CNN arguably has a liberal bias, but there is a difference that, generally speaking, we don't have state-run media in the same way. Generally speaking, Western journalists can ask tough questions of their government. Um, I mean, I hate Fox News, but someone from Fox News is not going to be arrested for criticizing or questioning President Obama. That's a fundamental difference. Chinese media like Xinhua, China Daily, and so on are directly run by the Chinese government. That, in my view, is very dangerous because it is not allowing any other perspective. Um, it's deeply unfair, and I have no patience for that. I think it's frankly despicable that the media could be so controlled in that way. And this isn't just a Western perspective. I have Chinese friends who have been media students, and they actually agree with me that there needs to be more openness. Because for one thing, it shackles Chinese journalists. It means they don't feel like they can really do their job because they constantly have to kowtow to the party line. And I don't think they're actually bad journalists. I think they could probably be professional journalists, but they just are shackled. Um, to be fair, maybe the situation is changing for the better. There was that young woman, Jing Chan, I believe her name was. Apologies, I don't remember her name exactly, but she made the documentary about pollution. Um, Now, as far as I know, that was more or less allowed. You know, she hasn't been put under house arrest or anything like that. I think part of the reason is because she had such widespread support, and because the subject matter was so topical, the government knows that the CCP is not stupid. They know they can't. If they were to jail her, there'd probably be a revolution because people know that she was speaking the truth. Chai Jing, that was her name. So all I'm going to say is, by all means, wave Chinese flags and all the rest of it. But just remember, this is the United Kingdom. This is not China. And just remember that you're guests in this country, um, and you have to behave as guests. And ask yourselves the question: how would you feel if a group of Westerners were behaving that way in China? Incidentally, I think I keep going back to the Beijing thing, and that was maybe an exceptional situation, but it does highlight something important that, in my opinion, that was an overt display of nationalism. In my opinion, we were way, way, way too tolerant of that. I believe at the time Gordon Brown should have made an announcement saying it was utterly intolerable that those so-called minders could push past British police in our cities. I believe that was unacceptable. Um, and certainly we should have reined in on the more violent aspects of the nationalists. There was a situation it was either South Korea or the Philippines, where a group of nationalists very nearly beat to a pulp a Tibet protester. And like I said, it's both sides. There are some on the other side who behave in a way that doesn't do them any good. But I do think there's a very ugly side to Chinese nationalism. There's an ugly side to any type of nationalism. Same with Scottish nationalism. Um, but the focus on Chinese nationalism is because it is very, very apparent. Um, and it isn't just, the embassy encouraging people to do this. It's well known that the Chinese Communist Party, just like Putin's regime in Russia, employs people literally to go online to spread their propaganda. I've come across one such individual. He calls himself Shanghai Noon. Every single post that guy has ever made, I've kind of observed him on and off for a few years. Every single post is about how wonderful the Communist Party is and making excuses for them, um, and attacking the West. Now, I believe I try to be more objective than that. I don't slavishly defend Western governments. And I don't believe that I demonize the Chinese government. Some things they've done is good. But I will say this, the idea that the Chinese government is above criticism is absurd, and it's incredibly arrogant. The Chinese government is not above criticism. If it wants to be a superpower, then it has to expect scrutiny. Simple as that. Um, there isn't really much more to say, but you know, Western societies are generally speaking very tolerant. We allow people to have their views. We allow people to demonstrate. Um, Definitely, if I had a grievance with the Chinese government, no way would I be allowed to demonstrate in Beijing. Yet during the Beijing torch relay, when Chinese students were pissed off at the way they perceived the BBC to be biased, what did the BBC do? They invited them on to have their say. So there is complete double standards here. And unfortunately, if you go to any video about the subject, it is swamped by nationalists who will talk about, oh, privileged Westerners and Western double standards and all of this. Very few of them, in my opinion, seem to be objective. Very few of them are willing to say a single word against the Communist Party. And I think that's very unfortunate. So, final few words. If you are Chinese in the West, I wish you all the best. I have no hostility towards you whatsoever. I wish you all the best. But just remember, this is not China. And remember that if you're displaying overt nationalism, that's going to come across as arrogant. Just imagine if you saw that in China, how would you feel? So I do think we need to be more assertive. Tolerance is great, but we need to be assertive. And we need to make it clear to people who are studying or doing business here, you have to respect this country and respect our values. And one of our key values is free expression. So I do think that if there are situations where human rights activists are being targeted, the people targeting them need to be absolutely dealt with by the law. And it isn't just Chinese. I've seen this from Thai royalists as well. This applies to anybody who thinks that they can bring the intolerance from their country and bring it to this country. No, we should not tolerate intolerance.